You're about to learn how the most powerful financial institution in the United States was designed in secret by a handful of men on a private island off the coast of Georgia, and for 20 years, every single one of them denied it ever happened. The Federal Reserve controls interest rates, manages the money supply, and acts as the backbone of the American economy. You interact with its decisions every time you take out a mortgage, swipe your credit card, or check your savings account. But the blueprint for this institution wasn't drafted in the halls of Congress or debated in public forums. It was sketched out during a clandestine 9-day meeting at one of the most exclusive private clubs in the world by 6 men who used fake names and pretended they were going duck hunting. This is the true story of how that happened, and to understand it, you need to go back to a moment when the entire American financial system nearly collapsed. It's October 1907. And the United States is in a full-blown financial panic. You've probably heard of the Great Recession of 2008. Now imagine something twice as bad, happening in an era with no safety nets, no deposit insurance, no central bank, and no government agency capable of stepping in. That's what the panic of 1907 looked like. The New York Stock Exchange plummeted nearly 50% from its peak the previous year. Banks and trust companies across the country experienced devastating runs as terrified depositors lined up to withdraw every cent they had. Clearinghouses in 73 cities partially suspended cash payments. Loans made by New York trust companies dropped by more than a third. Factory production tumbled 16%, and the real gross national product fell 11%, roughly twice the contraction you saw during the 2007-2008 recession. The entire system was melting down, and there was no institution in place to stop it. So who stepped in? A 70-year-old private banker named J.P. Morgan. You've seen his name on buildings and financial statements. In 1907, he essentially became a one-man central bank. He summoned the leaders of New York's biggest banks to his private library on Madison Avenue in Manhattan. He ordered them to open their books. Then he locked the doors and refused to let anyone leave until they pledged millions of their own dollars to keep the financial system afloat. It worked. Morgan's dramatic intervention restored short-term confidence and prevented a total systemic collapse. But it also exposed something deeply unsettling. The entire American financial system, the most powerful economy in the world, rested not on public authority, not on democratic institutions, but on the will and judgment of a single elderly man and a few of his wealthy friends. And that realization terrified people. Why should private financiers decide which banks lived and which ones died? What would happen the next time a crisis hit and there was no J.P. Morgan willing or able to step in? Between 1863 and 1910, the United States had suffered 3 major banking panics and 8 more localized ones. You can see how this pattern was unsustainable. Congress recognized it too. In May 1908, they passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission and tasked it with studying the banking systems of the world and recommending reforms for America. The man put in charge of that commission was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, and this is where the story gets really interesting. You need to understand who Nelson Aldrich was. He wasn't just any senator. The press called him the general manager of the nation. President Theodore Roosevelt called him the kingpin of the Republican Party. As one of the big 4 Republicans who largely controlled the major decisions of the Senate, Aldrich wielded enormous power, particularly through his position on the Senate Finance Committee. And if that wasn't enough to signal his connections to American wealth, consider this. His daughter Abby married John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only son of Standard Oil co-founder John D. Rockefeller. For 2 years after the commission was created, Aldrich and his advisors studied European banking systems. They traveled extensively, examining how central banks worked in England, France, and Germany. By late 1910, Aldrich was ready to draft a plan, but he had a problem. If the public found out that a group of Wall Street bankers had gotten together with a powerful senator to write a banking reform bill, the political backlash would be instant and fatal. The plan would be dead on arrival. So Aldrich did something extraordinary. He organized a secret meeting. In November 1910, 6 men received quiet invitations to join Senator Aldrich on what was described as a duck hunting trip to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Jekyll Island was home to the Jekyll Island Club, founded in 1886 and described by Munsey's magazine in 1904 as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. It had been purchased for $125,000, about $3.01 million in today's dollars, and served as a retreat for America's wealthiest families. The men were told to come one at a time to a train terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey, where they could board Aldrich's private rail car. They were instructed to use only their first names so the staff wouldn't figure out who they were. No last names, no titles, no formal introductions. Here's who showed up. There was Nelson Aldrich himself, the senator and chairman of the National Monetary Commission. Paul Warburg came too, a German-born investment banker and partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who had moved to New York in 1902 and was widely regarded as the chief driving force behind establishing a central bank in America. Henry Davison, known as Harry, was a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company who had started as an office boy at a small bank in Connecticut and risen to become one of the most powerful bankers in the country, founding the Bankers Trust Company along the way. Frank Vanderlip was the president of National City Bank of New York, which you now know as Citibank, and was closely associated with Rockefeller interests. A. Piatt Andrew was a Harvard economics professor who had been appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and Arthur Shelton was Senator Aldrich's private secretary. Together these men represented approximately 1/4 of the world's wealth at that time. Let that sink in. 1/4 of the world's wealth gathered on a private train headed to a private island under assumed first names. The lengths they went to maintain secrecy were almost comical. Paul Warburg, the sophisticated German banker, went so far as to borrow a shotgun and bring all the trappings of a duck hunter, despite the fact that he had never fired at a duck in his entire life. A. Piatt Andrew didn't even tell his own boss, the Secretary of the Treasury, where he was going. And then there's the moment at the train station in Brunswick, Georgia, that nearly blew the whole thing wide open. When the group arrived, the station master approached them and said, "Gentlemen, this is all very pretty, but I must tell you we know who you are and the reporters are waiting outside." You can imagine the panic, but Henry Davison kept his cool. He pulled the station master aside and said, "Come out, old man, I will tell you a story." Whatever Davison said to that man, it worked. He came back smiling and told the group, "That's all right, they won't give us away." The reporters disappeared and the secret held. On November 22, 1910, the group arrived at Jekyll Island. 2 days later, on November 24th, they sat down to a Thanksgiving dinner of wild turkey with oyster stuffing at the luxurious clubhouse, and for 9 straight days they worked. Paul Warburg directed the proceedings and wrote the primary features of what would become known as the Aldrich Plan. The discussions were intense, particularly around one crucial disagreement. Senator Aldrich preferred a straightforward European-style central bank with a single powerful institution at the top. But Warburg and the other bankers understood American politics better than Aldrich did in this regard. They knew the public would never accept something that looked like a Wall Street power grab, so they insisted on what Warburg called the politically palatable camouflage of decentralization, a system of regional reserve banks that would appear to distribute power across the country while still maintaining central coordination. Warburg's more politically astute vision prevailed, and by November 30th, when the meeting concluded, the rough draft of what would become the foundation of the Federal Reserve System had been agreed upon. As Warburg himself later recalled, when the conference closed, the rough draft of what later became the Aldrich Bill had been agreed upon. The matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled right there on Jekyll Island. In January 1911, Aldrich presented the plan to the public. By November 1911, the American Bankers Association had endorsed it, but then politics intervened. In 1912, Democrats won the presidency and both houses of Congress. Aldrich didn't seek re-election, and the Pujo Committee began investigating what was called the Money Trust, the concentration of financial power on Wall Street. The Aldrich Plan, bearing the name of a senator closely tied to banking interests and the Rockefeller family, was politically toxic. But here's what you need to understand. The plan didn't die. It was repackaged. The essential framework created on Jekyll Island was adapted into new legislation. Modern scholars like Elmas Wicker, Murray Rothbard, and William Grider have concluded that the final Owen Glass Bill, which became the Federal Reserve Act, was so similar to the Aldrich plan that there's little doubt the latter heavily influenced the former. Frank Vanderlip himself acknowledged this years later, writing, "Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted." As banker A. Barton Hepburn told the American Bankers Association in August 1913, the measure recognizes and adopts the principles of a central bank. Indeed, if it works out as the sponsors of the law hope, it will make all incorporated banks together joint owners of a central dominating power. On December 23, 1913, the Senate adopted the conference report by a vote of 43 to 25, with every Democrat present voting yes and all but 4 Republicans voting no. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law that same day. By November 1914, the Federal Reserve System was open for business. The secret held for years. The journalist B.C. Forbes first revealed the story of the Jekyll Island meeting in 1917, writing with vivid prose about a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily riding hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants. But even after Forbes's revelation, the participants themselves continued to deny the meeting had taken place. It wasn't until 1930, a full 20 years later, that Andrew, Vanderlip, and Warburg finally admitted to the meeting when they shared the story with Aldrich's biographer. The catalyst was Carter Glass publishing a memoir in 1927, claiming all the credit for the ideas in the Federal Reserve Act. That was apparently too much for the Jekyll Island group to stomach. When Vanderlip finally came clean in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935, he wrote, "Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator." He added, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." Now you might be wondering how you should feel about all this. And that's where it gets complicated. On one hand, the Federal Reserve has operated for over a century and remains the most powerful central bank in the world. It's guided the American economy through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and a global pandemic. It's overseen by a board of governors directly accountable to Congress and structured with 12 regional banks, a design that traces directly back to the compromise hammered out on Jekyll Island. On the other hand, the secrecy of its origins has fueled legitimate skepticism that persists to this day. Congressman Ron Paul's 2009 book End the Fed debuted at number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list, arguing that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional and economically harmful. More recently, Senator Mike Lee of Utah has introduced legislation criticizing the Fed, stating it has become an economic manipulator, directly contributing to the financial instability many Americans face today. As Federal Reserve historian Gary Richardson has explained, the secrecy wasn't arbitrary. Knowledge of who wrote the plan could have influenced people's perception of the value of the ideas and the likelihood of its political passage. The men on Jekyll Island knew that if the public discovered that Wall Street bankers had drafted the nation's banking reform bill, it would be dead. So they hid. And they kept hiding for 2 decades. What you're left with is one of the most remarkable ironies in American history. The institution designed to protect you from the unchecked power of private bankers was itself designed in secret by private bankers. The system meant to democratize financial power was born from the most undemocratic process imaginable, and the framework created during those 9 days on a private island behind closed doors using fake names has shaped every single financial decision that affects your life for over 110 years. The next time you check an interest rate, apply for a loan, or hear about the Fed raising or lowering rates on the evening news, you'll know the real origin story. It started with a financial panic, a locked library, a private train, a borrowed shotgun, and 6 men on an island who changed the course of American history while pretending to hunt ducks.